Is there a message of necessity at the desk? There is a message of necessity at the desk. Move to accept the message of necessity. The message is accepted.
Welcome back to Messages of Necessity. I'm Ken Girardin, Research Director at the Empire Center for Public Policy. Today, we're going to be chatting with E.J. McMahon, Empire Center's founder and senior fellow. E.J., we're going to have a fun conversation today about a consultant report that came out from the New York State Department of Tax and Finance. And this consultant report, I think you would agree, is a special one, because it was a state agency actually seeming to give a truthful assessment about something state government is doing. Tell us a little bit about it.
Well, this was done by a firm called, a fairly well-known finance firm in Philadelphia called PFM. There was a provision of the 2022 state budget, the budget enacted in 22, which was for fiscal year 23 last year, that required the state Department of Taxation and Finance to do an impact analysis of all of the different tax incentive programs that the state offers in the name of economic development. So there's a whole slew of them. The biggest of which, by far, is what's called the film production credit, which applies to video, TV, as well as motion picture productions. And in previous years, the state's economic development agency, called Empire State Development, has done a series of sort of credulous annual cheerleading reports that basically look at total employment by the entertainment industry in New York and say, this is marvelous, this is what the film credit is doing, and attributes 100% of film productions and TV productions in the state to the film credit. Now, if you are any sort of fan of movies or TV and are any age beyond much high school, you realize that all sorts of things were produced on an ongoing basis, and all sorts of movies have been filmed in New York since the dawn of the entertainment era for over a century. So the film credit wasn't responsible for them, obviously. In fact, the show that's sort of like in permanent running somewhere in the world as we speak somewhere right now in reruns, Law and Order, which is filmed on the streets of New York City largely, started more than 10 years before there was any tax break for filming in New York City. CBS, at enormous expense, retrofitted the Ed Sullivan Theater on Broadway for David Letterman in the early 90s, 10 years before we had a film credit. So there's all sorts of examples that could be used. But what happened is the film industry, motion picture industry, Hollywood basically, got this great racket going where they kind of leveraged and pit one state against another. Once states started offering refundable tax credits for productions to underwrite production costs, they were off to the races, and nobody fell for this more than New York. So what is a refundable tax credit? A refundable tax credit is money you get even if you don't owe taxes. So if you're a company that has got nothing else going on in New York, or even an individual, and you're funding a big production in New York, the state will send you a check for up to 30% of your production costs, with some exceptions, even if you don't owe taxes. So it's not really a quote unquote tax break, it's a subsidy, which this report we're talking about points out. The amount the state has been spending on this was, until recently, for more than a decade, was pegged at $420 million a year. Nearly $500 million a year. This is in checks sent to producers. This is not reduced taxes, principally. And that by itself was the largest such film subsidy, ongoing basis in the country. Last year, Kathy Hochul in the legislature agreed to increase it to $700 million a year, every year, from now through 2034. So there's going to be 11 years of $700 million a year promised on the books. So having spent $7 billion on film credits through last year, the state is now promised to spend nearly $8 billion more in cash, in checks to TV and motion picture production companies from now through 2034. There's just nothing like it. And so what's the argument that's made for it? The industry says, oh, it's great. I mean, we got all these productions being filmed. It's just marvelous. Again, acting as if it wasn't for the credit, nothing would be happening. And in what this study did that we're talking about, the PFM study for the State Tax and Finance Department, which was completed at the end of last year and sort of slipped onto the state website at the beginning of the year, it basically said that in fact, it doesn't come close to paying for itself. The guarded language that was used in the bottom line was based on an objective weighting of costs and benefits to film production credit is at best a break-even proposition and more likely a net cost. All of the evidence they cited was the more likely net cost basis. So what's the return on the dollar? In direct state taxes, it's barely a dime a dollar. This is attributing all of the productions to the credit. Its return is basically a dime on the dollar. If you take indirect factors, which is a fairly lenient way of accounting a whole lot of other stuff that supposedly contribute indirectly through local taxes in New York City and other places, put that all in the basket, this thing returns 31 cents for every dollar we spend on it, at best. So that's the definition of something that's not worth it. They made several other points, some of which are obvious, but which needed stating in an official state report, that given our existing workforce and infrastructure in the entertainment industry, most of the economic activity attributed to the credit would happen without it. That the jobs are, yes, high paying, but they're also episodic, that the industry, it goes from project to project. Now, even the most long-lived projects tend to be TV shows that last for a matter of years and then go away. Most of the money is spent on one-offs and on people who work jobs on sort of a craft or contract basis. So you work you work for 6 months or 3 months or whatever, as a guy who does the lighting or is an expert in some area of production on a movie that's being filmed on location in Brooklyn. And then after that's over, you seek out a job with another film that's being done on location in Long Island. So these are not enduring jobs. They're good jobs and they pay a lot. A lot of them are unionized. And that helps explain why this is even happening, why we're spending $700 million a year. You can't stress this enough. An outflow of $700 million a year, which is a lot even by our standards, because there's a constellation of people. There's production companies, all the usual Hollywood studios, which now include the key streaming services, Amazon, Netflix, and the like. TV networks, who continue to be big players in that field. Last but not least, the real estate moguls who have built and own big studios in New York City and get a lot of business out of this. Last but not least, there's labor unions who have increasing clout in the legislature and had a lot to begin with, particularly Teamsters, who get a lot of work out of trucking stuff around from one place to another, mostly in New York City, because that's the place that movies want to be produced in, but are elsewhere in the state to a much lesser degree. So, and a lot of these, so the Teamsters in particular and other unions connected with this also make a lot of money off it. And of course, it's got celebrities. You rub noses with the celebrity. We have no idea because this doesn't have to be disclosed. But imagine a business that needs to lobby for periodic renewal of a tax giveaway, of a subsidy to itself, that can also at other times say, oh, by the way, Assemblyman Jones, if you happen to be in the neighborhood next week, we'll be filming an episode of Blue Bloods on a street near you. Would you like to come by and watch? Would you like to get tickets to, for instance, Saturday Night Live? We don't know the degree to which that's happening, by the way, because tickets are technically free to TV studios. So to a show. I mentioned Saturday Night Live. What's the opening greeting of Saturday Night Live trademarked almost 50 years ago? The answer, live from New York. Do you realize that we're paying them now $20 million a year on average to do that? They're getting a subsidy to be in the city that they made their name off of, live from New York. Blue Bloods, a show that much beloved by my late mother, I remember. She used to watch it. She watched it like a religious observant every week, with Tom Selleck as the police commissioner of New York. It's been on for quite a few years now.
And his iconic sigh. I think they mic his mustache so you can periodically hear the dramatic exhalation while he reflects on the question.
Actually, I mean, it has a lot of fans. It tends to be people in my generation in particular tend to like it. And I guess it's kind of a traditional TV police show. As Law and Order used to say, the rip from the pages, from the news pages, assuming there's still pages. And that's established in New York. And as long as that show runs, it's been getting typically $20 million a year in subsidies. You're paying for this.
So you're saying
And
there was no danger it was going to move to Louisiana, which
no, I mean, what are they gonna, I mean,
state
like,
that
look,
started this whole mess.
I mean, what happened was in the 70s, Kojak, if you're old enough to remember Kojak, who was Telly Savalas played this detective. He would suck on a lollipop and say, "Who loves you, baby?" I won't imitate Telly Savalas, but if you remember, Telly he was famous for this bald, tough guy. And it said it was a detective in a New York precinct. They used to film some scenes in New York City. This is the early 70s. This show was on for a while. And then to save money, they moved their location shooting, their outdoor shooting to Toronto, famously. And this was seen as, it's another sign of New York City's decline. It's so expensive here that Kojak can't even film on our streets. Now, why this was a big deal was another question, okay? But ever since then, people have been saying we got to make this a more affordable place to film movies. Again, this conversation occurs almost entirely in New York City. And so the film credit, again, it started up in states that have no particular reason to attract film productions. If you are West Virginia or Georgia, particularly say a place like West Virginia or rural Pennsylvania, you're offering a sort of a generic rural or small town ambiance to somebody who's got a movie set in a rural area or a small town. So you pick them instead of upstate New York or Massachusetts or Indiana because they're offering you a subsidy. That's part of how it started. Canada started offering subsidies too, even though they have a considerable currency exchange edge. So we got into this game, and again, it just exploded here. It started out modest in the latter years of the Pataki administration, 04, 05, and it just soon reached this $400 million level. It was so politically sacrosanct that in the worst fiscal crisis the state has experienced in recent history, which was right when David Patterson became governor in 08, 09, the state suspended payment and reimbursement of every tax incentive on the books, except this one. It was not, it kept flowing. So that's how important it is to the political class to keep the money flowing to Hollywood East. And so this report is, I mean, it should have added significance due to its provenance. Unfortunately, you wonder whether it will because it's got so many friends for so many obvious reasons.
And you left out one of the ingredients to the film credit dynamic besides labor unions and celebrities and and the studios. You left out gullible lawmakers
Oh,
who
yes.
were content to accept the premise that nothing
Yes.
would film in New York ever again were it not for this subsidy. I want to encourage people to check out your blog post from February 12th, where you laid out in great detail the numbers behind this. But one thing that really struck to me was the $7.7 billion total price tag of what the state had shelled out for film and TV subsidies, even before the film credit got hiked
Oh,
to
it
7.
was 7 billion even before the latest increase.
Yeah,
Now
that's
it's
two
going to be
Tappan Zee bridges.
7.7.
That's like, I mean, just to put that in context for people, that's like two Tappan Zee bridges
Right.
almost.
Yes.
And
Yes.
one
Which we didn't pay for in cash, by the way.
right.
It's debt being paid off in tolls. But anyway, go.
But it also going back to the Pataki years, Dave Catalfamo, who was one of the economic development officials for Pataki
Right.
when the film credit, then $25 million per year, was getting airborne.
Yeah.
Even he's looked back at it retrospectively and said, these sorts of credits are supposed to build permanent infrastructure where the industry will survive without that support. And anytime anyone talks about trimming the film credit, and you'll remember Cuomo cut the film credit very slightly in 2020, the bottom fell out of the state budget. And you heard this braying from Western New York about, dear God, no one will ever film in New York ever again if we only pick up 25% of the costs and not 30%. And it bears noting to people that about 90% of the film credit flows to filming in New York City. It's not this isn't something that's really helping upstate. You end up with pockets of stuff, and Cooperstown is the latest spot where we've heard the local lawmakers say, "My God, how great is it? We're going to have 100 people working on a crew for a few days,
Yeah,
filming here in the
right,
iconic Otsego County countryside."
right.
And it doesn't justify 700 million because what else could you be doing with that 700 million? Even
Well,
if you
see,
were to,
that's the thing. This is a constant problem with lawmakers when they advance a pet project and they say, yes, it'll cost X, but think of what we'll get from it. And the thing that's never considered is, well, what could be done with X if we weren't doing this, whether it's a reduction in taxes and fees or an expenditure on something else. And you mentioned there's a couple of things. There were several major supposed big development projects, including a almost laughable proposal that was constantly advanced with straight faces by state officials for a major film studio near Syracuse, which vaporized within a few years. It's almost forgotten now. I think there was something else being talked about in Buffalo that recently filtered away. And the problem that state lawmakers have is the upstaters noticing that this is going mainly to New York City for what I think should be obvious reasons. They keep wanting to prod and amend the thing into offering higher reimbursements, which it does for productions upstate, as if it's going to be a big boost to the upstate economy. And it won't be. As we're noting, these are temporary projects. Even projects like, say, Blue Bloods, you're not going to have a show like Blue Bloods settling in, anchoring itself, and producing 8 or 9 or 10 years of a TV series in Syracuse. They're going to do it in New York
oh, here
City.
come the letters.
Well, right. Okay. I'm sorry. I meant Rochester.
I mean, or a place like Utica.
All right. I mean, it's just not going to happen. So, and it's always, so it's a distraction when it comes, but it's just not a big deal. And again, we're paying for it. There should be at the very least, we should legislate that in the credits at the beginning and end of each of these films, before anybody else, it should be say the producers greatly acknowledge the massive amount of money contributed to this project by the taxpayers of New York State.
And
Now,
we could have a montage of all the unfilled potholes and other state
yes,
priorities that were
yeah, right. I mean, here's an example. I mean, one other thing they talk about that comes up is there are, again, I've told you, one of the big promoters of this, among the largest promoters of this, are the guys who own the studios, the major studio, physical infrastructure in New York City. Now, some of these studios had actually been developed before the film credit, but some of the bigger ones have expanded or were built since the film credit was beefed
with
up.
state aid that you didn't count in your 7.7
With
billion
state aid not
total.
counted in that. Now, and city tax breaks too. But here's the thing. If there ever was an argument for the film credit, like the early argument was, the race to the top or bottom, depending on how you look, was, well, we have to offer the film credit because other states are offering it. Well, you now have an even bigger, more expansive filmmaking and TV show making infrastructure in New York City than you did before the credit. There should be a point at which somebody could reasonably say, all right, let's stop now. We've got all this studio space. We've already, to the extent it has financed anything permanent, it's financed expansions of existing studio space and production facilities in New York City. That's now there, and that is not replicated anywhere in the country outside of California. Which of course now has its own film credit. If there's ever a time to stop, this is well past that point, but it could be more justified than ever now. And that's, what obviously you don't see happening. You see the opposite arguments made.
Well,
So let me give you an example of how money could be spent, by the way. Right now, there are organizations lobbying in Albany. They just had a big press conference this week saying we need more tax credits for families. We should be helping families. This is an Albany version of an argument or a debate that's being had in Washington. There's a case to be made for increasing credits for children, say tax credits, refundable tax credits for children. You could just about double the tax credit, the state's existing tax credit for children, which peaks at $333 a kid, with the money that they spend on this film credit. And
I mean, you could, but the kids don't pay dues,
well,
and
yeah,
I think any of them can get the Governor and Emmy Award. So
a middle-class family with 3 kids, you're talking about $1,000, which would mean a lot. Let me give you another example, just pulled from random. There's no limit to what you can cite. The state now borrows over $500 million every year, borrows it, bonds it, $500 million a year as aid to local highway and bridge improvements. Now, it's called CHIPS, Comprehensive Highway Improvement Program, CHIP. It borrows that money, and it borrows so much that it, for many years now, has had almost an equilibrium where it has 500 million plus in debt service on CHIP bonds and $500 million in money going out the door for these things. You could eradicate the borrowing and with a piece of the film credit money, simply fund your aid for local highway improvements on a pay-as-you-go basis, which is what the state does, by the way, with school buildings. That's just one example of what you could do with this money. Or you could finance a partial rollback of the increase in corporate taxes that was passed in 2021, for instance. There's, again, any number of things could be done with $700 million that would be more beneficial to the state than simply handing it to Hollywood East.
Well, and just to wrap up here on a high note, one way that you could crack down on this would be with an interstate compact, getting states to say, well, we'll all stop this at once if enough of us or enough of the big actors can agree to all stop doing this at once. And there was a proposal from Senator Julia Salazar a few years ago.
Yes, there was.
And I've got to say, it's very interesting to see the better ideas on this front coming from progressive Democrats compared to basically, what is largely, with few exceptions, been radio silence from conservative Republicans.
Well, I mean,
Rob Orr's an exception.
There are exceptions to that. I mean, Julia Salazar is a socialist. I mean, in fact, a self-described Marxist. Now, I'm not sure if you went to her and said, how about we get rid of the film credit, that she'd give the same answer, because a lot of her colleagues, a lot of her progressive DSA colleagues, and their best friend in the Senate leadership, Senator Gianaris from Western Queens, they make a big exception for the film credit. They're big fans of the film credit. So you'll also often see organizations on the left attacking the state's lesser tax incentives that the state has, and also attacking all the things that industrial development agencies do locally, the property tax breaks, et cetera. Now, that's another subject, and a whole lot of that is also ripe for criticism. There's no question it should be criticized. But note the strategy here. The film credit, which is, again, can't be repeated enough, $700 million a year in cash outflow, is lumped in with scores of other programs that all combined don't have a budgetary impact, state and local, of $700 million a year. And so they're all talked about as if they're equal, when in fact, the big one, the really big one now, especially now, is the film credit. So to give you one last comparison, people are kind of outraged at the large amount of money that the state is spending to subsidize the construction of a new stadium for the Buffalo Bills in Buffalo. I forget what the number, I lost track with the numbers. It's well over $500 million. But it's a lot of money. It's a capital project grant funded by debt. That doesn't, debt is real too. But this thing is every year is basically spending the cost of the state's share of a new stadium in Buffalo every year or two, going out now to 2034 in cash.
Right.
Again, pick your local giveaway outrage, whether it's state or local, and this is several multiples of that. And so it deserves to get attention. And groups that claim to be posturing that they're enemies of corporate welfare, and they want to have this sort of moral posture of being opposed to subsidies of the corporate world. Frankly, they don't deserve to be taken seriously unless they zero in on this. Because when they lump this in with everything else, they're basically giving cover to it. You're making the film credit part of a group of other things, not all of which are as big a waste as the same study we're talking about found.
Absolutely. Well, I want to thank you for joining us, EJ. I want to encourage folks to check out your article. I want to encourage folks to check out this really, really refreshing consultants report. I think Governor Hochul deserves tremendous credit for letting this thing ever see the light of day. and hopefully it inspires folks in Albany to rethink the way they've been doing this stuff. But we'll keep an eye on it. We'll have you back on soon to talk again about more parts of this report. In the meantime, thank you again for joining us. Please share these episodes, please subscribe, and continue checking out and supporting our work at empirecenter.org. Until then, podcast adjourned.
For more news and analysis, visit our website and sign up for email updates at empirecenter.org. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn at Empire Center.